The third meeting of the Interim Joint Committee on Appropriations and Revenue, Wednesday, August the 4th, 2021, 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard. We're in Annex Room 149, and all the usual warnings that everyone is accustomed to are still good about your cell phones if you're appearing remotely. And does anyone have any special guests to recognize? Seeing no one, is there an Anthony Allen in the room? Anthony Allen, you stand up, please. And think this may be your first attendance of the A&R meeting? Great, well, welcome, good to have you here. Otherwise, will you call the roll, please?
Senator Carroll. Thank you. Senator Caslin. No response. Senator Givens. Thank you. Senator Kerr. No response. Senator McGarvey. Thank you. Senator Meredith. Thank you. Senator Nemes.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Senator Webb. Thank you. Senator West.
Present in district.
Thank you. Representative
You want
Beckler.
some? I'll share.
No response. Representative Bentley. Thank you. Representative Blanton.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Bridges. Thank you. Representative Dossett.
Present in the committee room.
Thank you. Representative Fisher.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Fleming.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Flood.
Present, 75th District.
Thank you. Representative Fugit.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Gentry.
Present in my annex office.
Thank you. Representative Goforth.
Present in my district.
Thank you. Representative Hale. No response. Representative Hart.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Hatton.
Present in the committee room.
Thank you. Representative Nemes. No response. Representative
I'm
Palumbo.
present in my office and the annex.
Okay. Thank you. Representative Palumbo.
Here in my annex office.
Thank you. Representative Prunty. No response. Representative Raymond. No response. Representative Reed.
Here in the room.
Thank you. Representative Riley.
Present on the road.
Thank you. Representative Santoro.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Tipton. Thank you. Representative Wilner.
Present in my annex office.
Thank you. Co-Chair McDaniel.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Chairman Petrie.
Present in the room.
We have quorum.
Mr. Chairman, this is Alice Kerr, and I'm present in my district.
Thank
Can
you.
you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, and thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
Representative Beckler actually made it.
thank you very much. Anyone else to record on roll? Thank you. We have a quorum. I'll entertain a motion on approval of the minutes from the July 7 meeting.
Motion to approve the July 7th meeting.
I have a motion. Is there a second? Second. I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Minutes are approved. And then up today on agenda item number 3, Kentucky's current economy and inflation compared to the nation. Michael W. Clark, Director, Center for Business and Economic Research, if you will approach the table. If you will introduce yourself for the record, please. Make sure that one's on and pull it close.
I'm a little out of practice. Apologize.
All good.
Again, my name is Mike Clark. I'm an associate professor of economics at the University of Kentucky and director for the Center for Business and Economic Research at UK.
Very good. Will you raise your right hand? You swear or affirm to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. If you will proceed on the topic.
Okay, let me get my PowerPoint presentation set up, and I'm told I need to make sure I share my screen, so let me find the Zoom here and we will take care of that. Okay, I think I should be good. All right, thank you very much. For those of you who are not familiar with our center, I want to take just a moment and kind of explain who we are and what we do. Again, we're the Center for Business and Economic Research. We're referred to as CBER for short. And we basically do applied economic and policy research for state and local government agencies, business groups, and community groups. We do a number of things in terms of our activities, but there are two things in particular that I wanted to point out to you that I think may be useful for you. First is the Kentucky Economic Annual Report. CBER is directed by statute to produce an annual report describing the Kentucky economy. And we produce these usually around February of each year. We distribute these to members of the General Assembly, so you should have received one. If you have not, please check with me and I will make sure that you get one, and staff has some copies as well. The second thing that we produce is actually produced in conjunction with the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. This is a quarterly report that we've started recently, just kind of describing recent trends in Kentucky's economy and comparing those trends to our surrounding states and to the nation as a whole. And most of the material I cover today actually comes from this quarterly report. So as you're looking for updated information, you'll be able to find that updated information in future reports. So both the national and Kentucky economy has made marked improvement over the past year. Economic output has continued to improve. Employment has rebounded substantially, but still remains stubbornly below pre-pandemic levels. And even though our economy is improving as a whole, we do see that the recovery has been somewhat uneven as we look across different sectors, with some sectors seeing employment levels that are very similar to where they were prior to the pandemic, and others that are still lagging behind. Employers are hiring, but the nation and Kentucky both are seeing relatively low labor force participation rates that have made it difficult for employers to find workers with the skill levels that they need. And then more recently, we've also seen indications that inflation is starting to uptick, and so that's starting to raise questions about whether or not we could be seeing long-term price increases in the future. So our most kind of broad measure of economic activity is what we refer to as gross domestic product, or GDP. And GDP basically is just the value of the goods and services that are produced in an economy. And so you can see on the left-hand side the level of GDP for both Kentucky and the nation. These are on two different scales. Kentucky is blue and is in billions of dollars. The nation is in red and is in trillions of dollars. But you can see, of course, that we all kind of understand this now. We've all been tracking the economy. We see the impact that the pandemic has had on the Kentucky economy and the national economy. From the first quarter of 2020 to the second quarter of 2020, GDP declined by 10%. Now, on the left-hand side, you're going to see percent changes, and these percent changes for GDP are typically shown in annual rates. So the actual decline was about a 10% decline from that first quarter to that second quarter. On an annual rate, that is, if that were to last for a full year, which is the way we kind of show these numbers typically, that's about a 35% decrease. So Kentucky's GDP declined at an annual rate of 35%. That doesn't mean we lost a third of the economy at that point in time. We really lost about 10% of the economy. But you can see that there was a significant contraction in the value of the goods and services that we produced, but then the following quarter, that increased substantially. It didn't make up for all the differences. We were still lagging behind, but each quarter since then, we've seen that the output that we produce has increased substantially. If you look at the past expansion from 2009 through 2019, GDP grew at about 2.25% on an annual basis. And so you can see over the last few quarters, even though we had that big jump as businesses reopened during the third quarter of last year, each quarter since then we've seen improvements, substantial improvements in our economic output. The most recent data for Kentucky comes from the first quarter of this year, and that showed an annual growth rate of 6.4%. We're still a little bit below where we were prior to the pandemic. The most recent data for the nation came out last week, and it shows that national GDP, even adjusted for inflation, has reached pre-pandemic levels. Now, that's not where we would have been in the absence of the pandemic, but it shows that we are certainly catching up. Another important indicator is unemployment insurance claims. So here I'm showing initial claims for unemployment insurance, and you can see that, again, they have come down substantially from where they were, when we were in the heat of the pandemic. But they do remain high relative to where we were prior to the pandemic, and they've been somewhat volatile from month to month. So again, we're still seeing some businesses are reducing their payrolls. Maybe it's because they're facing uncertainty still, but we are still seeing additional workers leaving leaving employment. I want to spend a few minutes talking about our unemployment rate. This is a measure that gets talked about in the press quite a bit, and we've got to be a little bit careful with how we read the unemployment rate because it can be easily misunderstood if we just focus on the unemployment rate. So here I'm showing the unemployment rate for Kentucky and the nation. And we're showing 20 years of data. And one of the first things you'll notice here is that, not surprisingly, Kentucky's unemployment rate generally tends to be higher than the state's unemployment rate. Of course, with the pandemic and a lot of the business closures, we saw unemployment rates increase. Then as the businesses reopened, we saw those numbers decline. But over the last year, we've seen the unemployment rate in Kentucky fall well below the national unemployment rate. And in fact, we've reached levels that were fairly similar to where we were prior to the pandemic. And so I've seen some people kind of misinterpret this, and I've seen some headlines suggesting that some of our communities have actually gotten back to where they were prior to the pandemic. And I don't think this is an accurate assessment of the situation. And it really has to do with what the unemployment rate is really measuring. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of focus on the last year and a half. So this is the same data I showed you in the previous chart. We're just kind of focusing on it. But the unemployment rate is basically calculated by contacting households throughout the nation. This is a federal agency that contacts them and asks them questions about all the individuals living in that household and their employment situation. Based on these questions, individuals are assigned to one of three categories. If they were working during a specific time period last month, they're working for pay, they're classified as employed. If they were not working for pay, but they were actively searching for a job during the past 4 weeks, that is, they were applying for jobs, going on interviews, some activity where they're really searching for work, they're classified as unemployed. Now these two groups, employed and unemployed, that's our labor force. So when we talk about our labor force, that's who we're talking about, people who are working or people who are searching for work. The other group are people who are not in the labor force. Now this not in the labor force group can encompass a lot of different situations. It can be my son who is in school and focusing on his studies full time, not looking for a job. It could be my parents who are elderly and retired and are not searching for a job. But it can also encompass a lot of situations between that. And one of the things that we've seen over the past year and a half has been a number of people who maybe were employed just prior to the pandemic, who lost jobs, but for whatever reason, they're not actively searching for work. They may want jobs, they may need jobs, but they're not actively engaged in search activity. As a result, they're not classified as being unemployed because they weren't searching for work. They're classified as being not in the labor force. And so that's an important distinction when we think about the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is just the number of people who are unemployed, is without a job and looking for work. Those who are not in the labor force, for whatever reason, do not get calculated in that number. And so the unemployment rate misses those individuals. And we think we've had a pretty large increase in the number of people who maybe have dropped out of the labor force, at least temporarily, for various reasons. So the unemployment rate kind of misses that. And so that's part of why our unemployment rate looks really low relative to the nation. It's good that we're low, but we ought to understand exactly why we're low. So the unemployment rate is not one of my favorite measures for this reason. I like to look at a few others and kind of look at them in combination. So the first thing I like to look at is how many people are actually employed. I think that's a better indication of how we're doing over time. So here what I'm showing you is the employment to population ratio. I'm showing it for both Kentucky and the US. So here what we're basically saying is of our population that's 16 and over, there are a few categories that are excluded, but generally our population 16 and over, what percent of them are employed? And you can see in January 2020, just prior to the pandemic, about 57% of our population actually had a job. That's well below the nation, which was at 61%. But again, that's prior to the pandemic. What you'll see is that there's a gap there of about 4.2 percentage points. Now, when the pandemic hit, of course, a lot of people lost their jobs, but we've seen that that has bounced back somewhat. But as you look at kind of this pattern across over time and across the nation and Kentucky, you see a very similar pattern. Where we stood as of June 2021 is we were still down in terms of the percentage of our population that was employed compared to where we were prior to the pandemic. So even though our unemployment rate looks really low, we have fewer people working. So that amounts to about, I'm trying to remember the number. I think it was about 100,000 individuals, although I have to double check that. Fewer people working in Kentucky than there were prior to the pandemic. Another thing to look at here is the gap between where Kentucky stands on these numbers and where the U.S. stands. Prior to the pandemic, again, it was about 4.2 percentage points. Where we were as of June was, again, about 4.2 percentage points. Now, that gap has changed over time, but it's kind of gotten back to where we were prior to the pandemic. So what we're seeing in Kentucky in terms of number of people working, the trend overall has been fairly similar to what we're seeing across the nation. Another measure that I like to look at is the labor force participation rate. So this basically is comparing, again, those people who have a job and are searching for a job compared to the population. So what percent of our population is actually in the labor force? So this tells us a bit of a different story. Again, our labor force participation rate tends to lag the nation. But again, there was about a 4 percentage point difference between the U.S. and Kentucky. Over time, we saw those numbers change. They've come up a little bit, but the U.S. has actually come up faster than Kentucky has. That gap between where Kentucky is and where the U.S. is has actually widened to about 5.3 percentage points. So in terms of employment, the number of people working, we're really doing well keeping up with the nation. We're about in the same position as where the nation was, from where we started before the pandemic to after. In terms of labor force participation rate, we seem to be lagging a bit at this point. Now, why are the labor force participation rates in both Kentucky and the nation lagging? Well, there are a lot of reasons that are being discussed for this. Certainly there are still health concerns for many workers. They may be concerned about going back to work and that may expose them to COVID, and that may be a health threat for their families. Limited access to childcare is certainly an issue we're hearing a lot about. And we're also seeing an increase in the number of people who have retired during this time period. Another issue that you don't hear discussed quite a bit or quite as much is a skills and geographic mismatch between what employers are looking for and what potential workers might have to offer. So, we have a lot of businesses that are looking for workers, but they're looking for a specific skill set. A lot of the people who lost jobs may not have the skill sets to meet those particular positions. And so that may be one of the reasons we're not seeing as many people coming back into the labor force and finding jobs. The other issue we hear discussed quite a bit is, of course, the enhanced unemployment benefits. And the concern here is that with the higher level of unemployment benefits that individuals can receive, that may provide a disincentive to get out and find work. Now, all these are issues that seem to be at play here. It, however, is not really clear how much each of these individual factors is contributing to the overall lower labor force participation rate that we're seeing in Kentucky and the U.S. Okay, so I'm going to turn to another measure of employment. This data actually comes from businesses where we asked them about, well, how many people do you have working for you? How many jobs do you have available? And of course, you can see, that this recession, of course, was very significant in terms of just how quick it occurred and the loss of jobs. Over the last year and a half, after we've seen that, that drop, we've seen a lot of that employment come back. Of the jobs we lost last year in, I think it was March and April where we really started losing jobs, we've recovered about 69% of those jobs or replaced them with other jobs. So, we've made some progress in terms of getting our employment back up. Here I'm looking at the same data for Kentucky, but I'm also looking at the U.S. And the way I'm showing this is I'm basically benchmarking all of our data to where we stood in January 2020. So the idea here is if you look at any month, you can see what that employment level was relative to what the employment level was in January 2020, just prior to the pandemic. This allows us to see how we're doing over time and how we're doing relative to the nation. And so you can see in April, the employment losses were, again, significant. Our employment was down from January 2020 by about 15%. For the US, it was about 14.5. As we were coming out of this decline, we were making faster gains in terms of recovering our employment than the rest of the nation was. So for several months there in 2020, we were doing really well relative to the rest of the country. Now, over the last 6 months, we've seen that the nation has really caught up to us. And if you look at where we stand as of June 2021, our employment was still down by about 4.6% relative to where it was at the beginning of last year, just prior to the pandemic. Very similar to what we're seeing in terms of the nation. In terms of the count of jobs, that's about 90,000 fewer jobs than what we had just prior to the pandemic. So again, we're seeing a substantial recovery, but we're still not where we were prior to the pandemic. Okay, so the next few slides, I apologize. I know you can't read these on the screen, but I'm a data guy, and so I like to throw a lot of data to you. I know you have this in your packets, so I would refer to you there, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over these. Basically, it's just the same data for each of the major employment or major industrial sectors in Kentucky. And so you can see how each of those sectors have changed over time and relative to U.S. employment. The next slide provides fairly similar information. This is just Kentucky, but this puts it not in percent terms, but in terms of jobs. How many jobs had we lost from the beginning of 2020 over time? And so you can see kind of where we stand. And so I'll let you look at that on your own. I just kind of want to mention that that's there. Okay. We are also seeing a substantial increase in the number of job openings. Now, here I'm showing U.S. job openings, but you can kind of see from looking at your packet, not the screen, that job openings have really increased. And we're seeing a lot of additional job openings across most of our major industrial sectors. And so that's really encouraging. We have a lot of employers out there who are looking to fill positions. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, our labor force participation rate is low. And so we're hearing from a lot of businesses, at least anecdotally, that they're really struggling in terms of finding workers, and particularly skilled workers, to fill those positions. So here we have a situation where basically the demand for workers on the labor side, or on the employer side, is high. Employers are trying to fill positions, but there's not as many workers to fill those positions. And so when that happens, what we tend to see is wages go up, or essentially what we're talking about is price for labor. And so we are actually seeing evidence of this. Again, this is US data, but it shows how wages and salaries are changing each quarter relative to where we were 12 months before. So if you look at this kind of over time, here I'm showing you about 20 years of data. When we were coming out of the previous recession, wage growth was stubbornly slow. It wasn't even keeping up with inflation. We started seeing wage growth over the last few years, just prior to the pandemic. So wages were really starting to grow on an inflation-adjusted basis. We were seeing that wages were growing faster than inflation. And normally when we enter a recession, what tends to happen is we got a lot of people who are looking for work, and we have few jobs. And so when that happens, wages, we don't see that upward pressure. But we are seeing upward pressure now because the situation is different. Right now we have is a lot of demand for workers, and we don't have as many workers available. So wage pressure has stayed up. And so we're seeing that in the data, that wages are continuing to increase. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to pass over the next couple of slides unless somebody directs me back to this. This information is available in our quarterly report that we are providing. But I want to go ahead and move on to inflation because I think that's one of the things that most of you are particularly interested in today. Okay, so over the last 3 months, we've been seeing evidence of prices increasing. Now, there's several different measures of inflation, and I'm going to talk about a couple of these in the slides that I have here. But the one we hear most commonly is our Consumer Price Index, or our CPI. And so what this is basically measuring is the overall change in price. And I know you've had some discussions in previous meetings about this, so I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but give you kind of a general sense of what I see going on right now. So here, again, you're looking at about 30 years of data. The price increases that we've seen over the last 3 months have been very significant. And you can see if you look at the orange line there, what you're seeing is all items, all the things that we spend our money on, except for energy and food. Energy and food are very volatile from month to month, and so we often exclude those. But you can see that if you just look at that all items except for those volatile categories, inflation has really jumped up to levels that we haven't seen in a really long time. And so, of course, the question is, what is potentially driving this? And will this be something that we see for a long period of time? Well, there seem to be several things driving this. First of all, if you look across the individual categories, you see certain categories are seeing significant price increases. And I've just shown you a few examples of these. And you know, if you read the Wall Street Journal or the business page, you've heard about these before. The increase in new cars, you know, we've seen a substantial increase in the price of new cars. And it's largely due to these supply chain issues. You know, you've heard about the chips. And the problem is, of course, you know, without the inputs, there are fewer cars available for people to purchase. Demand has stayed strong. And so as a result of that, we've seen upward pressure on prices. As prices for new cars have increased, people have looked to substitute towards used cars, and that's driven those prices up. From May to June, the inflation that we saw, which was, you know, pretty significant, used cars accounted for a third of that increase. So what we're seeing is a lot of things that, due to these supply chain bottlenecks, that, you know, are really causing our prices to go up. Now, these seem to be things that are probably temporary in nature. You know, part of the reason we're having these problems with chips is because consumer spending patterns change dramatically. You know, businesses, they have these very efficient supply chains. You know, they try to understand, you know, what consumers are going to want when they're going to want it, not keep a whole lot of inventory in place. And so they're just producing enough. They had a pretty good track record of kind of understanding what consumers wanted. You know, not perfect certainly, but a very good track record. With the pandemic, that changed consumer demand dramatically. And so chips were being allocated to different places. Who would have thought that demand for cars would stay so high? Who would have thought demand for lumber would have stayed so high? And so businesses are really struggling trying to figure out exactly where is consumer demand going to be and adjust their supply chains accordingly. So over time, we would expect that some of these changes in consumer demands will settle down. Businesses will start to adapt their supply chain so that their inputs are going to where the demand is. So most of these inflation prices or inflation pressures that we're seeing are likely to go away over time. It's difficult to say exactly how long that will take to shake out, but these are things that seem to be temporary. Another factor that's playing into this, you remember I talked about wages a few slides ago. As businesses are trying to get workers, they're finding they're having to compete for those workers. And as they increase those wages, they're passing those costs on to their customers in terms of higher prices. So as wages have started to increase, you know, again, we've seen some inflationary pressures. Now, we think a lot of this, again, will be temporary in nature because we think the labor force will start to come back to normal as COVID starts to go away. Again, it's not clear how long that's going to take, but as workers start to return to the labor force, as child care issues start to be resolved, as unemployment insurance benefits, enhanced unemployment insurance benefits start to expire, we would expect that maybe that labor force would start to pick up a little bit. And so we would see some of that wage pressure ease, and that would in turn ease some of the inflation pressures. Now, I don't actually produce a forecast of inflation. I don't have a new forecast for you to look at. But what I have done is I wanted to show you kind of what a lot of professional economists who are responsible for developing forecasts have been showing. Now, the next few slides are going to show distributions of their projections for inflation over the next few years. These projections are from data that was developed prior to the last inflation numbers coming out. So we may see that these forecasts change as they adapt to new information that becomes available. But where they stood as of the most recent readings that we have, I'm showing you here on these next two slides. So this first one are economists that the Wall Street Journal surveys. And they're just asking them, what do you think inflation is going to be over the next couple of years? And so here what we're showing you is a particular type of chart that's basically showing the distribution of their responses. And what you can see here is with these different boxes, the line in the middle of the box shows the median. So 50% are saying inflation is going to be above that level, 50% are saying it's going to be below that. The X in the middle of that box is the average. The width of that box, 50% are in that box. So 50% of the forecasters think that inflation is going to be within that particular range. The dots tend to be outliers. And there's always some. But what you can see there is, as we look at these economists, what they seem to be telling us is that we can expect inflation to be high for the rest of this year. And inflation has generally run a little bit below 2%, where we've been seeing it run above that over the last 3 months. They're expecting inflation to continue to be high through the rest of this year. And as we move into 2022, they see it being, again, higher than what it has been historically, but coming down. So, if you look out kind of long term, through the end of 2022 and 2023, they're seeing inflation come down a little bit over 2%. So again, higher than what we had been seeing before, but not substantially higher than what we had been seeing before. The next chart basically is looking at what the members of the Federal Open Market Committee or the Federal Reserve think is going to happen in terms of inflation. So when they were asked about what June inflation would look like, this is a histogram of their responses. There's 18 participants, and you can see where each one of them kind of fell in terms of where they thought inflation was going to be. Again, their expectation for June was that it was going to be higher than what it had been in the past. Now they missed this a bit. Inflation actually came in higher than what they were expecting. But as we move into what they think it's going to be through March 2022, you see that they're saying, okay, well, we think inflation is going to be high for a while, but as we move into next year, that a lot of those inflation pressures are going to start to come down. And as, again, we move into, middle of next year and 2023, their long-term forecast is suggesting that inflation is likely to come down around 2%, which is very close to the Fed's target. So again, the expectation for inflation at this point, and I concur with this, is that we are likely to see inflation relatively high for a period of time. But as we move into next year and the following year, we should see a lot of these inflation pressures ease. Of course, there is a substantial amount of uncertainty with economic forecasting these days. So, kind of in conclusion, things to watch is, remember, the consensus forecasting group, of course, will be meeting. They will be developing a forecast of the state's general fund and road funds, and they will be looking at the economy and inflation as well. We're continuing to keep an eye on what's going on in terms of insurance claims. And, I would reiterate that, there's several different sources where you can, get data from. But as you're looking at these, particularly the unemployment rate, be careful about how you interpret that. I tend to focus, again, on employment and labor force participation rates. So with that, Chairman Petrie, I would turn it back over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from Senator Carroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Doctor, very interesting information. My question is this. We often hear what has happened over the past year as a false economy, simply because within our country there are trillions of dollars being infused, government dollars. And how does that impact your ability to gauge really where the economy is, both on a federal level and within the state, when the dollars that are being spent within the state, many are coming from the government? So how does that factor in? How do you all account for that? How can you draw an accurate conclusion when these are not dollars earned through a job or through production or anything of that nature? It's just dollars. We're spending government dollars. Help me understand that.
Okay, so I think I want to make two distinctions in terms of your question. The first is, how do things look right now, and in kind of our rear view mirror? How have we done over the past year and a half since we've been in the pandemic? And then where I think maybe it's a more important question is, what does this mean for us going forward? So in terms of where we stand now and in the past, we still see, the counts of employment. So even though a lot of that is supported by additional federal spending or reduced interest rates, we're still seeing how that is flowing through the economy. And so we're still seeing that, even though they're getting this through maybe enhanced unemployment insurance benefits or through stimulus checks, we're still seeing how that is going through the economy. That's showing up in our employment numbers. And so it's still providing us an indication of how many workers are employed and what their earnings are. And so, we're still getting good data on that. I think really the difficult part then is understanding, well, what does this mean for where we go over the next couple of years, particularly as that stimulus starts to evaporate. So the idea behind the stimulus, of course, is that when consumer spending or business spending is down, if we can prop that up a bit with fiscal stimulus, then maybe we don't lose these relationships we have. Businesses don't shut down. We don't see destruction of jobs, and so we can keep those going for a period of time. The issue is then, how do we transition as consumer demand starts to come back? How do we transition then to consumer demand driving those jobs as opposed to the stimulus? And that's a tricky thing, and that's something that the government agencies have to figure out how they're going to balance that. And so it's a matter of how do you taper that? How do you time that? And can you do that in such a way that you don't create additional problems? And so with additional problems, kind of think about the situation of, if we're trying to maintain employment, we can add stimulus to help people continue to work. But the concern is, as we add stimulus, if consumer demand is high and we're adding that stimulus, then government demand is also high. Does that start to create inflationary pressures? And so, it's kind of like driving down a car and you got your concrete construction barriers on one side and you got the semi-truck on the other side. You don't want to oversteer either direction, right? And so that's the same situation you have here. You want to think about, how much are you steering one way or the other? And that can be a tricky thing in terms of trying to understand exactly, how do we transition as consumer spending is coming back and tapering off that government spending?
So many different layers to this, and just in a general question, was with the impacts of the stimulus money that has come down, were these things predictable as far as the labor market and the increase in wages being necessary simply to fill the jobs? If you had a goal to do that, the things that are happening, would that be the process that you would go through?
Predictable in what sense?
Well, in that the labor market would be reduced and it would end up in wages being driven up, not based on demand or the economy itself, but simply because the workforce just isn't there in order to draw workers in.
I don't know that I necessarily would have anticipated this at the beginning of the process. As we were first starting to see the pandemic take hold and some of the policy responses to address that, it seemed to make sense that you were providing additional unemployment insurance benefits. Now, of course, the question that you always have with unemployment insurance benefits is, do you overcompensate? And so, there always was some question of, to the extent that you provide additional benefits, do you create a disincentive to work? So, economists have always talked about how, that's part of the policy challenge in setting unemployment insurance benefits, is, you want to make sure you have some additional benefits there that allow workers to find good matches. But you don't want to overcompensate so that you disincentivize them from going back to work. And so it's a matter, again, trying to find that sweet spot. With this situation, we had a very different occurrence. The idea was you had workers who were unemployed because of a health issue, and we didn't really understand, how that was going to play out. And so, you needed to provide some additional benefits for them. I think it was at least to some extent expected that there would be some difficulties as the economy started to come back, and that, you'd have to think about what is the appropriate timing for the unemployment insurance benefits and when those should end. But it's difficult to know exactly when that should occur.
Ask one more. Okay. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. With the jobs, mainly in our area, and I'm sure it's this way all across the state, retail, restaurant industry, are the factors that have caused the shortage in labor, and it seems to be more prevalent in those maybe that wage category. Are there particular reasons that would make it more the supply of employment being affected more at a higher level in those industries? And I'm not asking this correctly. In those level jobs, as far as pay, what would be the most obvious reason that there are so many openings in those jobs within that pay range?
I don't know that it's obvious. Again, I think we can point to certain things that we think are contributing, but it's not clear to me how much each of those factors are contributing. So as we move across different sectors, I think, all those probably play some degree of a role. And, I might, look at leisure and hospitality as, I had those list of different factors contributing to lower labor force participation rates. I could certainly see where all those would play some role. Retirement may not be as substantial in that particular sector. Childcare might, again, just kind of depending on who fills those types of positions. And so, it's really hard for us to know exactly how each of those contribute.
And these would be the jobs that, with the unemployment and then the extra dollars that come in with the unemployment and the stimulus checks that would likely you would be making more money by not working. And so there's a lot of talk that is what has caused that labor market to decline within those jobs, simply because you make more money by staying at home. Is that a logical conclusion?
It is likely that contributes. It's difficult to say how much it contributes, though.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on an earlier question by Senator Carroll. Stimulus money and the money supply and how that might affect inflation. Do we have any, or do you have any analytical information about what's left still coming? We have future bills, infrastructure bills and others that are being spoken about and discussed and that are possible. But those bills that have already passed, all of that money has not hit the ground yet. Do we have any idea how much more is coming? And then if you could hit the question of the more money that comes out on stimulus, how that might affect inflation in the future?
I don't track the progress of the additional funds that are coming in terms of fiscal stimulus, so I don't know how that is going to be proceeding. There's always a concern that with fiscal stimulus, that it may tend to come at a time where consumer demand is high, and that if you have consumer demand and government demand increasing, and supply not able to keep up, that would tend to push prices up. There's a lot of debate about whether that is going to occur or not, and I don't think it's obvious to me exactly whether we're set up for that situation. One of the things has to do with what is the slack capacity that we have in our economy. We know we're not operating at full capacity. We're still operating well below where we were. Even though output has really come back, there are a lot of reasons to think that there is additional capacity where supply could be increased. Part of that has to do with what we're seeing in the labor force. We still see a lot of people who are not in the labor force that as they come back in, that will increase the supply. And so that could mitigate some of that concern about inflation.
And I didn't mean to. I know we've got another question coming, but the factors affecting the labor force, and you mentioned those, some of those factors seem categorically different, at least as far as my concerns. Health concerns should be something that subsides over time. So it would be a temporary factor on that labor participation rate. Access to child care, you would think, would be somewhat constant, regardless of the circumstances, unless there's a bigger capacity built in. Increased retirements, that seems more of a permanent exit from the workforce. Now, I understand people can retire and come back in, but that one seems more permanent in nature. Skills and geographic mismatch, we can try to work on. That's a longer range problem. Enhanced unemployment benefits, that should be a short-term factor. Do you have any data on the increased retirements, or whether any of these factors you look to continue over the next 24 months or longer?
So
On
the
the
issue,
labor, on the, and their effect on the labor
Right.
participation rate?
so we don't have specific data on Kentucky. We know from national studies that retirements have increased. While yes, these people are they could be permanently out of the labor force. Some of them may come back. We saw this in the last recession. Particularly in construction, you had a lot of workers leave the labor force because construction, work had really kind of ended. Had slowed down substantially. And so you had a lot of construction workers who maybe were getting close to retirement age. And so, what were they going to do? They retired early. And so we see that now, right? We're seeing the same type of thing. You have a lot of people who are close to retirement that maybe they were going to retire in 2021 or 2022 or 23 or so on. And so they're retiring a few years early. Now, some of those people may come back as the economy improves. Most of them probably won't, but those are people who were going to retire over the next year or two or three anyway. So we will eventually catch back up. And so that won't be as much of a long-term drag as maybe you might initially think.
Co-Chair McDaniel? Nope. Anyone else have a question? Representative Fleming, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor, I just want to ask you, obviously in this, some time ago, we experienced stagflation. Do you foresee that in terms of shaping up and hitting that particular phase of the economy based on how things are shaping up?
I don't see that as an issue. Partially right now, we're seeing that we have actually really good demand for goods and services. Businesses are trying to hire, and I think, over time that will work out. And so I don't think we're looking at a period of stagflation.
Okay, do you, a quick follow-up question, Mr. Chairman? Thank you. I've come across some information that Kentucky's dependency on the federal government has significantly increased to about, probably ranking around 4 of all the states out there, and the personal income is becoming more of a significant, coming from the government, more significant play in that. And then what the chairman mentioned in terms of more money coming down the pipe and so forth, do you see that as a catalyst to further put us in a tough situation when it comes to inflation from a transaction velocity point of view, or not?
So we're actually talking about a couple of different things here. Right. Kentucky's dependency on essentially transfer payments and other types of federal support. And I haven't looked at the numbers in some time, but we do, compared to other states, receive a relatively large portion of our total personal income from transfer payments. And so, those are things that, tend to be fairly stable. Taking aside unemployment insurance, but things like Social Security, disability payments, and things of that nature, those tend to be things that are fairly stable and really are not really tied to kind of the economic performance. So I don't necessarily see those being huge issues.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Bridges?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Professor, I appreciate your information. I've got a couple of questions or concerns. You'd mentioned the wage pressure,
yes,
and you anticipate that to decrease. When you correlate that with the inflationary rate, that you alluded, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you talked about the increase in wages that employers have had to come up to offset the unemployment bonuses to incentivize these people to come back to work. In that, have you calculated that when the unemployment benefit goes away, do you anticipate those wages to go back down? Or are these employers are you anticipating that to stay at that level? And would that not push inflation even further rather than, is that in your considerations or your projections?
So I haven't made any projections or calculations, but, we can kind of think about, what things might look like as the enhanced unemployment benefits expire. And so to the extent that is contributing to workers not, getting off unemployment insurance and finding jobs. And again, we're not sure how much of an effect that is having. But to the extent that it is having effect, as those expire, we would expect to see more people moving back into the labor force and searching for work. And so what's probably going to happen is that would ease some of that wage pressure. Doesn't mean wages necessarily go down, but they may not continue to go up as much. And so as they stop increasing as much, we might not see as much wage or inflation pressure as a result of that.
Okay. One follow-up question. You had mentioned the output increase even with a lower unemployment with the production. Have you considered or taken into consideration that those employees may not be needed now that the employers have figured out we don't have to have as many people to put this, their output is higher, so would that offset it and still have a weight?
You know, there are going to be some long-term challenges for sure. And we're seeing, you know, as you go about your business, you know, and you go to different stores and restaurants, you're seeing where there has been a change in how businesses operate. You know, they've been trying to figure out how do they get by, you know, without workers. You know, to continue to survive, they've had to adapt to this situation. And I think that's going to continue to play a role. Now, my sense is that demand for workers is still very, very high. Demand for skills workers is especially high. And so I think the challenge is going to be, as we look at the workers who maybe lost jobs, that as they try to go back into the labor force, those same types of jobs that they had before are no longer there, or there's just not as many. Those workers will need to adapt as well. They'll need to find different types of jobs, and that may require different types of skills.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, and you made a thank you for making a distinction or separating the focus on unemployment rate and labor participation rate and how those work together as well as other factors, but how they can only inform one another. You can't rely on one without the other mainly. Similarly, the same thing is true about our inflation generally, and wage growth. You can't really look at one without the other. For instance, if you have 4% increase in wages, but you have a 5.2% increase in inflation, your wage growth is actually negative in the pocket feel for someone on the ground.
Absolutely. You've got to consider that.
Yeah. And so we need to take careful note that, yeah, wage growth, and that sounds good, but your inflation has to come down to actually give that a net positive, or else you're actually losing ground. So right now, even though we've got uptick in wages, we arguably are losing ground because of inflation. Hopefully that comes down and continues to come down, but we've got to keep an eye on that. Accurate enough?
That's correct. You have to watch both of those.
All right. And lastly, I'm just going to ask this. Any recommendations for this committee to keep an eye on certain factors, listen for certain things, or consider certain things as we approach the upcoming budget session and trying to get a feel for where Kentucky's going economically?
I think, you know, the measures that we've talked about today, I think, are the big ones. So the ones that, you know, I really want to put in front of you and have you keep an eye on, particularly the employment numbers and particularly those that come from businesses, the business survey. And we provide through Kentucky Center for Statistics a press release every month showing that. And you might also be interested in some county level data that they also produce, which will be more specific to your districts, which I think will be particularly important for you to watch. But most of the things that I've discussed today, those are the things that you really need to be watching, in my opinion. We can do that. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quickly, when you talk about the calculation for the unemployment rate, and that the group of people who are not employable or are not actively looking for a job, how does Kentucky rank as far as maybe per capita or compared to other states in that area?
I haven't looked at how we rank in terms of other states. You know, obviously in one of my slides I showed how we compare to the U.S. But I haven't looked in some time. Now, the annual report that we have, I think it may have some additional information looking at some competitor states. And so, you know, I'd refer you to that, but I don't know off the top of my head.
So it doesn't give, you don't have to provide a legitimate reason if you just say that I'm not looking for a job. That's all it takes?
Well, in terms of the classification, yes. I mean, we might call you up and ask you about, you know, are you working? You know, what type of search activity did you engage in terms of trying to find a job? But if you didn't engage in some active search for a job, then you would likely be classified as not in the labor force.
Okay.
Except for, some small exceptions.
And I don't guess I ever would have imagined that that would have been the way that we determine those rates. I mean, it's basically nothing more than a survey, and how accurate are surveys? I would have thought there would have been a more scientific way that we calculated those rates. So that's something different. Do you feel comfortable with that their accuracy in those methods?
I think generally they are accurate. There's a lot of work and research put into developing these unemployment rates. I think you have to understand, though, that there are limitations. Because, how else are we going to find out about individuals' employment situations except to ask them? As I've talked to different groups, I've found that some people are surprised that it's not based on the number of people who are filing for unemployment insurance. Well, there's a good reason we don't do that. It's because you may not qualify for unemployment insurance, but you still may be unable to find work and trying. So, that would miss out in a lot of people that we'd really need. So I think the process that we generally use is accurate. It is subject to a margin of error, and there is noise in those numbers from time to time. And particularly, when we've run into this pandemic and things have just been so different, it has at times been a challenge to collect that data. So you can imagine, if you go around, send, somebody to knock on somebody's door during the pandemic, they may not be real happy to open the door and talk with you. And so that did pose some challenges. And so, we have to be aware that, yes, this is a good process. At times, there may be additional noise there. And so when we look at the economy, we try to look at a number of different measures so we get as accurate of an understanding of what the economy is doing as possible, recognizing that each one of our measures has some limitations.
Okay. Where can we find data related to those who are not in the workforce as to why? You don't really hear much about that, but I think that's probably every bit as important as the unemployment rate.
I don't recall any specific reports at the moment that really focus on the why. Now, the survey data that is collected does ask questions about why they're not in the labor force. And so, it'd be possible to do some analysis, certainly at the national level. Sample sizes get small at the state level, and so we may not get real accurate data for that small of a group. But there is some information available on that.
Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. My
Mr.
pleasure.
Chairman.
Thank you very much. And Senator Meredith?
Yes, Mr. Chair, and thank you. Just a quick clarification, follow up on Senator Carroll's question for you, because I think you made note of this earlier, that unemployment rate by itself really doesn't have a whole lot of value, that we really need to look at in the context of also the labor participation rate, correct?
Yes, sir.
And since there's not an exact science to this by any means, so could we draw a conclusion by having kind of a multiplier effect from the labor participation rate on unemployment? I mean, wouldn't that give you a little bit different number?
We do have different numbers available that look at different situations that workers find themselves in. So we don't hear about these very often, but we actually have a number of different measures of unemployment that look at a lot of those different situations. And so, that information is available. It's just not usually the headline number. So yes, there are a number of different measures that you can use to get a much clearer picture about these different situations.
I think that'd be beneficial to us. We say just for discussion purposes, in Kentucky unemployment rate's 4%, but you got a participation rate that's 25% worse than national average. That really the effective rate is more like 6% rather than 4%, and I think that gives a clearer picture. But again, just want to reinforce that we look at an employment rate, but also labor participation rate to get the clearer picture.
Yes, and the trends over time. How are these changing? Again, the numbers that I prefer to look at are the employment numbers. How many jobs do you have? How many people do you have working? Because those are the people who are supporting their income is what is going into the economy. And it's also going into your tax revenues. So, when I look at this, it's not just the unemployment rate, it's how many people do you have working in your district. That is really, really important. How many jobs do you have? And as you start thinking about how that has changed, and all these other people who maybe are not working, you start thinking about, well, if that's a large number of people that I have who are not in the labor force, are not employed, what are the reasons? And, you know, if you're representing a district where maybe you have an older population, I'm not at all going to tell my father that he needs to get back into the labor force participation. Or, you know, our rate's low, he needs to get a job. I'm not going to tell him that. But it's important to kind of understand what are the characteristics within your areas that maybe contribute to these different labor force participation rates.
I would agree. And, you know, I would think in terms of workforce development policies that we're trying to develop, we need to be aware of that, because just not having the workforce there is subject to a lot of different interpretation as to how we develop that workforce. And that's good information, but thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Demus.
Real quickly, I think I heard you say something I want to make sure I understand. You say you're not going to tell your father to go get a job because labor force participation rate's low. My understanding is your father likely wouldn't be in that because that's working age population. So my question is this. Effectively, 1 out of every 2 Kentuckians within working age population is not working. Our employment rate is about 53% of, my understanding is, working age able-bodied people. Is that correct? And you said, with some exceptions, who's pulled out of that? So when we're talking about the employment numbers, 53% of Kentuckians, who is that and who is it not?
We typically see, I'm not creating the numbers, but civilian, what we're referring to is the civilian non-institutional population. So the military is not included in that. The people who are institutionalized or maybe in prisons are not included in that. And people age 15 and younger are not included in that. Now, my father is, you know, he would be calculated in our labor force participation rate, and he's going to be thrilled to hear how much a role he played in today's presentation. And I'm going to be in the car with him for 10 hours this weekend, so you know this is going to be a fun weekend.
You got to tell us his name.
His name is Harrison G. Clark. But yes, he you know, when we look at the official labor force participation rate, it's 16 and over. So you know, even people who are you know in their 70s, 80s would be in that number. Now we also see oftentimes people using different cuts of the population. One of the ones that I like to look at to deal with this issue of, you know, you got a lot of people in school, that's not a problem with your labor force if you got a lot of people investing in education. And if I've got a lot of people who are maybe older, that's not necessarily a problem. So oftentimes what we do is we look at the prime age workers, which would be like 25 to maybe 55 or something like that. You know, and that gives us a slightly different number that accounts for some of these different groups.
If that's easy to get, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for that number, the prime age worker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to make sure there's a reason that we talk about these workers and employment rates and labor participation rate, and I think you mentioned it briefly. These people are a large portion of the taxpayers that contribute money to the general fund for which we're able to operate the state. And so it's important that we know who they are as best we can and encourage them to remain working, even your father, as long as he can do so.
I think he's done.
Right. Thank you very much. Very good presentation. Actually, Representative Beckler.
Thank you. This is very quick, and it won't impact any numbers. But I am curious, are state legislators considered employed?
Have you been called by the BLS and asked that question? If you have a job, you would be considered employed if you have a job with pay. I don't know that for sure. I'll have to look into that. I'm not sure I can get you a good answer, though.
I've not been
I
called.
think you probably would be.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Very good presentation. Thank you so very much for agreeing to come in. Next up on the next agenda item that we have is Budget Director Hicks, I believe. I'm sorry. Budget Director Hicks, are you joining us remotely today?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you, and now I can see you, and I see financial outlook report on the screen that you may want to make larger. There we go. I think we're good to go.
All right.
If you will just introduce yourself for the record, please.
Yeah, my name is John Hicks. I'm the State Budget Director for the Commonwealth, and I am happy to be here today to describe for the committee one of the best fiscal pictures we've had as we closed out the fiscal year 2021.
Very good. If you'll raise your right hand, please. You swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, please proceed. Thank you.
All right. Well, mainly talk, I'm here to talk about the prior fiscal year, 2021. And most of it is a revenue story. And it's what an unexpected one that it was. And I'm going to touch base on both the general fund and the road fund, both on the revenues and the final surplus calculations. So I've got a chart here for the general fund revenues for fiscal year 2021. You see the major categories of tax types to the left. The first column of numbers are the actual receipts, $12.8 billion. And right next to it was the budgeted estimate for fiscal 21, $11.7 billion. And so the result, over to the right of it was a $1.1 billion revenue surplus, which is an amazing number. A number that is more than triple the highest revenue surplus that we know about. For the fiscal year, to the far right hand, you see the percentage change of fiscal 21's actual receipts compared to fiscal 2020. 10.9%. That was the highest annual growth rate in 26 years. You can see led by the top three tax types: sales and use, individual income, and the business taxes, corporation income tax, and the limited liability entity tax. Those taxes make up 80% of our general fund revenues, and they made up about 87% of the surplus. You can see over the right-hand side a real similar number: 328 million surplus from the sales tax, 330 for individual income, and 335 from business taxes. A 12% growth rate in sales tax, and I'll talk about some of these individually, but it hit on all cylinders in terms of not only comparison to the estimate, and a reminder, the estimate was revisited in December of 2020 for the 2021 regular session as they put the budget together for fiscal year 2022, the year we're now in. And it was raised by about 126 million from the original estimate. So even that raise was small compared to the surplus that eventually resulted. So I'm going to talk about some of the highlights here, but first let me show you a little bit about the quarters that made up the fiscal year. And on the far left side, I thought for instructive purposes, I include the final fiscal quarter of fiscal 2020. That was the April, May, and June of 2020, right? The most affected by COVID-19. And you can see we had a unsurprisingly decline in revenues at that time, a 4.5% decline in that final fiscal quarter, even though we ended the year with positive revenues. And then as we moved into the fiscal year we just ended, the first quarter, a growth rate of 5.8%, the second quarter, 5.3%, the third quarter, 6.7%, and then an amazing 25% increase in quarter four. Now that's countered against that minus 4.5% of the prior fiscal quarter in fiscal 20, but still really outstripped both expectations and the prior year. So some milestones about that. The sales tax, the 12% increase, the highest growth rate since we raised the sales tax from 5 to 6% back in the 1990 session. Online sales tax expanded to over 270 million. One of the better things that all the sales tax states, with the exception of Missouri, who finally came on board, passed the online sales tax. That was truly a prescient act by states all across the country, because it really maintained the ability to retain the sales taxes on consumer and consumption that went heavy into the online during the COVID. For the business taxes, that was a 38.1% growth rate for fiscal 21 between the two tax types I've mentioned here. That's the highest we've had since fiscal 2006. And it was a real big change from the prior 4 fiscal years where growth rates were basically flat. And here we had a 38% increase. Well, clearly that showed that, it's always tough to predict, the underlying trends related to corporation income tax. It's one of the toughest revenue types to forecast. But clearly, we had a situation of high profitability, and firms are, finding that even limited supply, as you all talked about in the prior presenter, can boost margins. So that was a very positive result. Property taxes, while not a huge portion of the general fund, did grow 9.2%. And I wanted to highlight that real property grew at 4.4%, the highest in 14 years. Assessments were the primary reason they grew 6.5%. And it's going to be the first year in the year we just started in which we're going to have to adjust the state the state property tax rate, given the limitations, of House Bill 44. But the real outlier here was tangible property receipts, which grew 16%, but led by motor vehicles at 23% growth rate. So that is associated with the car sales that you all have talked about previously, and that I'll talk about a little bit further when I hit the road fund. Other highlights: the individual income tax. Withholding is the largest component of individual income tax, and it grew by 5.9%. That's the highest we've had since fiscal 2015. Even when you count for unemployment insurance benefits that were withheld, the growth rate would have been 5.8%. So again, a very positive element, and some of what Mike Clark showed you, kind of respond to the fact that high wage workers, middle income workers, primarily were not heavily affected in terms of their income and their jobs related to COVID-19. Estimated payments were high, 16.7%. These are the quarterly estimated payments that are not withheld. So that was another good feature of that. In the business taxes, corporate profits in Kentucky rose 14.3% over the first 3 quarters of fiscal year 21. The sales tax, that 12% increase, we are seeing a lot of similarities across our peer states. Many states have experienced double-digit percentage growth rate in their sales tax. And then the lottery, one of your subcommittees this morning had a hearing with the Higher Education Assistance Authority, which spends most of our lottery funds, brought in $347 million, $75 million more than last year. And based on a provision in the Appropriations bill, $58 million of the excess is parked and awaiting disposition in the next budget. Here, let me talk briefly about the surplus. I just talked about the revenues being above the enacted estimate by $1.1 billion, but we also have spending lapses. That's unexpended general fund appropriations of $41 million and another item of $8 million. So our total surplus for fiscal year 21 in the general funds, $1,172.7. So $1.2 billion almost. And a little bit on the spending lapses. We normally don't have a high value of spending lapses. There were a couple of things that happened. Number one is we had a surprisingly high balance in our health insurance budget for school district employees. So it was almost $16 million. And that's simply a function of headcount because we have a fixed value of the employer contribution to premiums and the waiver contribution. So simply a function of fewer numbers of participants. Also in the area of corrections, as I have reported to you in the past in various ways, we had a lower prison population, both in the institutions themselves and out in the jails and halfway houses and other community settings. And so we had a $14 million unexpended balance in the Department of Corrections, and about $3.5 million of that was some of the difficulties in our institutions at hiring and retaining correctional officers. And then a little over $9 million that's based upon just lower prison population, whether it was in the institutions due to medical and food costs, or whether it was in the county jails where we had a lower head count than budgeted and therefore didn't have to pay for them. So that's a little bit of the highlights on the spending lapses. So in the budget bill, there is a general fund surplus expenditure plan, which guides what do you do with any general fund surplus. One of the first things is the ability to set aside some amount for the upcoming year for necessary government expenses. Those are things like matching FEMA disaster grants, the calling out of the National Guard. We have several other items that in the budget bill give authority when they exceed their appropriated amounts to be able to pay for them. So we set aside 10 million. We set aside 15 million last year, but didn't spend but a little over 3.5 million, I believe. And one of the reasons was some of the additional assistance that the federal government gave in regard to the work of the National Guard. And then so our deposit to the Budget Reserve Trust Fund becomes the primary use of the general fund surplus. So here we've got a deposit of $1,162 million. That is, that is a amazing amount of surplus that's going to the general fund, Budget Reserve Trust Fund. Let me talk about that, our rainy day fund. So with that deposit, it's the largest deposit ever, no surprise. Last year was actually the second highest, 162 million. And that brings our Budget Reserve Trust Fund balance up to over $1.9 billion, which is equivalent to 16% of our fiscal 22 general fund appropriations. And as a contrast, entering the Great Recession, the balance in that rainy day fund was only 2.3% of the general fund then. So we have moved substantially with this past year into having a rainy day fund that is surprisingly high and very good news. Kentucky has for years been one of the lowest ranked states in terms of the size of its general rainy day fund. And so we have fixed that problem in one fiscal year. So let's move to the road fund. Same kind of table here showing the fiscal 21 actual receipts, tax types to the left. Actual receipts is the first column, $1,642 million. I know that the Transportation Cabinet has given some testimony this morning on these figures. Compared to the budgeted estimate of $1.577 billion. So a revenue surplus of $64.6 million. The bulk of that is motor vehicle usage or otherwise the sales tax on the purchase of vehicles. A 24% increase over the prior year. Now remember, at the end of fiscal 20, when we had the pandemic, we had a really large reduction in motor vehicle usage tax. But in any case, and I'm going to talk about the highlights, that is extremely high. But just as importantly was the motor fuels actual receipts, only 7+ million shy of the estimate. But more importantly, that number to the right, it was a growth over the prior fiscal year. And given what was happening during the pandemic, we really, motor fuels took the biggest hit in the final quarter of last year, understandably, as the amount of miles driven dropped substantially. So that was very positive and very difficult to estimate. Our revenue forecasters clearly hit right on that one. A few other things, that were higher in terms of estimates, motor vehicle license, motor vehicle operators. Some of that was pent up demand from the prior fiscal years where citizens couldn't get into the county clerk's offices. And so we know that some of that kind of was an overlap from the prior year. But overall, a 10.1% increase in revenues over the prior fiscal year. And I'll show you a similar slide here on the quarterly growth, because I wanted to show you how substantial the road fund dropped at the end of fiscal 20 in that April, May, June of 2020, almost 24% drop. And then fairly flat, 1.9%, almost flat the next two quarters. And then look at that fourth quarter. Even though we were down 24%, we were up 44%. That is more than was expected. It was a nice surprise to have. And it hit, as I showed you earlier, heavily in the motor vehicle usage tax. So let me talk about some milestones there. The 10.1% growth rate was the highest since fiscal 2011. And that was when motor fuels tax rates were still increasing. And the total of road fund revenues, $1,642 million, was the highest ever. And as the Transportation Cabinet has shown you numerous times in the subcommittees and the full committee, the road fund has not been a rising source of revenue given the same gas tax rate and the mileage efficiency, that comes with vehicles these days. And so a very, very positive, fiscal result. On the motor vehicle usage tax, we broke the 600 million total receipts for the first time, and that's the highest annual amount by more than 100 million. So again, just the phenomenon of high demand for the purchase of cars really was something that wasn't expected, but has resulted in a very positive revenue growth. And I'll just remind the committee, this was the 7th fiscal year of the same gas tax rate. And at 3 of the last 6 years prior to fiscal 21, we actually had declines in a year over year of that category. So let's talk about the road fund surplus. $64 million in revenue surplus, but a $97 million total road fund surplus. And that had to do with spending less than budgeted, primarily in the transportation cabinet. And a couple of things that are understandable, like in vehicle regulation, the pandemic, put a pause on the ability to progress on standing up, the regional driver's licensing locations and other things, and in the transportation cabinet, the administrative areas spent much less than was budgeted. Because remember, in the construction account, in the highways budget for construction, any leftover balance continues into the next fiscal year. So that it's not included in here as a lapse, because that funding rolls over year because of the multi-year features of spending on road and bridge construction. So $97 million, the budget bill puts all of the road fund surplus into the highway state construction account, $97 million. That is the largest number we've put into the highway construction account in 25 years. And actually, I don't have the data prior to that, so it could be much higher. But very good news on both fronts. A couple of things that I didn't mention before, Mr. Chairman, but wanted to touch on is, as we look forward to fiscal 22 in the general fund, the enacted budget estimate is $11.85 billion, which is 7.6% less than the $12.8 billion we collected in fiscal 21. Our recently published quarterly economic and revenue update forecast that in the next 3 quarters, first 3 quarters of fiscal 22, that the general fund will grow about 3.3%. And as Mike Clark mentioned, the Consensus Forecasting Group begins its biennial revenue estimating process here on August 13th, where they will put together a 5-year planning estimate for both the general and road fund. And that'll be the first public available estimate of what we will have to deal with when we put the next budget together in the 2022 regular session. And then they will update that in October and then have a final official revenue estimate in December. And on the road fund, our quarterly report projected that in the next 3 quarters, the road fund will grow about 4.6%. And again, it is statutorily required for us to forecast those 3 quarters out. So again, on August 13th, we're going to get the next picture of our revenue situation as we look at the current fiscal year and the next 2 years in the budget process. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stop and be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. And I have a quick question, I think, by Representative Prunty, who may be virtual. No one wants?
I'm here. Sorry.
Okay, please proceed.
Well, it all sounds rosy, and I guess my question is, I guess I was expecting to see more infusions of federal monies coming in. Can you just kind of give an overall explanation as to why things are so much better under these circumstances?
Certainly, I'll give that a try. Thank you for the question. Number one is that the economy adapted more quickly to the pandemic than anyone expected. No question about that. We also saw that the significant job loss that happened at the beginning of the pandemic was highly concentrated in low-wage workers. And low-wage workers do not pay a lot of income taxes. That's not a negative. That's not a criticism. It's just true. And so middle income and high-wage workers were able to maintain their income. And so therefore the income tax and withholding was able to not only hold, but it actually rose more than expected. Sales tax, that 12% growth rate. Again, you'll see national information on savings rates where they drastically increased due to the pandemic. Individuals were not spending money, say, on travel. They were not going out to restaurants. And instead, they were spending, on more tangible goods, those goods we tax. And so the federal infusion early on, the Paycheck Protection Program for businesses and the household payments to individuals clearly was an assist in propping up the consumer behavior, particularly of lower income workers. And for more middle income, one of the things it did was actually raise their savings rate. But also clearly they had a greater amount of consumer consumption activity, as indicated by our sales tax increases. So the thing to understand as we look forward is that those big programs are finished. On September 6th, the expanded unemployment benefits expire. The Paycheck Protection Program is over. Those kinds of infusions to individuals and to businesses are pretty much complete right now. And so the forecasting as we move forward are really about moving into the underlying economic conditions that aren't affected. And while there is, as one of the members mentioned, there are still plenty of federal dollars that haven't been spent yet, but those are not federal dollars, I'll say, that's going directly to individuals, households, or directly to businesses so much as they are programs like one of the subcommittees this morning heard about the child care dollars that will, help businesses, but those are starting to winnow away. And some of them, like Chairman Petrie mentioned, the infrastructure bill that may occur here soon, those funds are going to be spent over multiple years, that $550 billion in additional funds.
Thank you. Just follow up real quick,
Please,
Chair, Mr. Chair.
quickly.
My concern has been the long-term effect on my kids and my grandkids, that, all the federal money's coming down. So, how's that going to play out over time? Do you have any kind of prediction of that?
No, I do not.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Co-Chair McDaniel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe we'll get Dr. Clark up here to opine on that last question. Yeah, I see that. I had to chuckle when you said there's a great deal of uncertainty in the data, because I think that every economic doctoral dissertation has to end with there's a great deal of uncertainty in this data or you automatically flunk. But all of that being said, and Director Hicks, I think that you'll largely agree with what I have to say here. To the same end that the folks who ended up laid off as a percentage of the income tax are not as high of a percentage, those who were more likely to be laid off were in the less than the median household income of the Commonwealth, and those folks who are less than the median household income were in fact more positively impacted by the unemployment and enhanced unemployment benefits. Consequently, we actually saw them as greater participants in the income tax portion of the general fund than otherwise we would have necessarily seen them in a regular environment. Is that correct?
I think some of that is correct, Senator McDaniel. I think in some cases, because of the way our income tax is structured, some of the ultimate income levels of those individuals who were unemployed and receiving benefits weren't subject to all of the income tax because of the deductions. But yeah, there's no question that there was an input. In fact, we tracked on a monthly basis on a withholding those individuals who opted in to have their unemployment benefits withheld. We tracked that closely, on a monthly basis. So clearly, and particularly early in the pandemic, in the prior fiscal year, we had a really substantial amount of withholding taxes from those individuals.
Right, and I think my number is correct that we utilized about $600 million in COVID funds that otherwise would have been general fund revenue that helped contribute to the surplus. Is that roughly the area we ended up in last fiscal year?
I think that was a combined number from that last fiscal year and a little bit from our fiscal 20.
Okay. And then lastly, as predictable as an economist, saying that data has a great deal of uncertainty is me being the wet blanket for everybody here. And I will remind everyone that these are good numbers. This is a much, much, much better place to find ourselves in than we did 8 years ago when we did not have a rainy day fund remaining in the Commonwealth. But I will remind everybody that most everyone here has been on a committee recently where you heard testimony from the Kentucky Teachers Retirement System that at a minimum, they will require an additional $200 million per year for the next 25 years to continue to keep pace with what's going on there. So I don't want everyone to see these things, and this is always the admonition from the budget chair. Don't see a surplus and think you can spend it, right? And it doesn't matter what party, that's our job. But understand, we have historical obligations as well that still got to be honored before we begin taking a look at these things, as well as leaving ourselves in a position for the next downturn. Because while, Director Hicks and Co-Chair Petrie, from the time we all sat in this room and really tried to figure things out 18 months ago when we had no idea what was going on, the next downturn, we might not find ourselves so fortunate is to have massive gaps plugged by federal funds, and we need to be prepared for those. So, Director, thank you for your time. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you very much. And along those lines, I'll say, in looking at numbers and the comparisons, always look at, like Mr. Clark, I think, had even talked about, look what you're comparing. Are we comparing to last year? Are we comparing to historical averages? You can get some very large percentage change when you have a year like last year that tanked on almost every economic metric that you could imagine. So an increase slight would be a large increase in percentage changes. Likewise, with TRS, what we understand will be a sizable increase in their request alone. Incarceration costs, which are a large portion of our state budget, from all projections I see, will pick up pace. They already are. They will continue to pick up pace. I don't see that curtailing very much. We also have a lot of pent-up demand during the COVID shutdowns that popped out almost all of a sudden. You've got some fairly consistent demands, but we have a lot of aberrant pop-outs where the increased demand pops out, and you've got shortages on cars that impact that demand. Would I think next year or the next 2 years we're going to have the same type of increases or numbers on car sales? Probably not. Even if we have chip shortages abated, will that demand still be there? No, because everyone's got a car now. It'll be a few years before they start that replacement cycle on volume numbers. So yes, you can look at any one number and I can make it look great. I can take any one number and make it look horrible. The bad part and the difficult part is putting it all in context. Next, I have Senator Carroll. Question, comment?
Yeah. Comment, Mr. Chairman, just along the lines of what we just heard. And, I really wish I could get excited about all this news. And it's just very difficult, though, because we know that this money is basically coming from the federal government. So where our economy may very well be on fire, but it's free money that's being burned. And it's the next generations that are going to have to pay that money back. And that's a given. I mean, at some point, the reality of it is our national debt's going to continue to grow and our population is going to have to pay it back. And we may be reaping the benefits from it now. And I know there may be a lot of political gain that comes out of this for the federal and the state level. But the reality of it is that our grandkids are going to be the ones that are going to have to pay this money. And I would rather this outlook not be so great than to stick that debt on the generations that follow. I don't think it's fair to them to do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Hicks, as you were giving your presentation, I was reminiscing about March 2020. Yourself, Rocky Atkins, came over and sat down with the conference committee on the budget. And there weren't many smiles in the room that day. We really did not know where we were. And one thing I want to point out as we look at this budget surplus, at that point in time, we were prepared to make some additional appropriation increases. We made the decision not to make that because of the uncertainty. So as we look at this budget, even though it's really, we're still behind pace with what we need to do providing services for our state. So that's important to remember. And again, I think maybe we need to look at this current time maybe over a period of 2, 3, 4 years and kind of have an average out and see where we wind up at the end of this. There's a lot of talk in Washington. You mentioned about an infrastructure bill, money coming down historically. As federal dollars have come to the state's been required to put up a match. A lot of times it's been historically 80% federal, 20% state. Where is the Commonwealth of Kentucky positioned at, should this federal dollars come in, to be able to make our state portion of the match if it's also required this time?
No, thanks, Representative Tipton. And you're really correct about what it was like in March of 2020 and what we had to do to hold back and make sure that, we were able to meet the needs. I don't have the answer for you yet on the infrastructure bill. I've only been through a part of it, haven't yet seen, but soon I'm sure we'll be seeing from national associations projected allocations on a state-by-state basis. From then, we'll be working with the transportation cabinet and be able to ascertain, again, what the match requirement is for the roads and bridges. Also, I have read through the broadband section of the infrastructure bill because we're going to have a little update on that here in a few minutes. But right there, highway, transit funds that'll be coming down.
Very good. Representative Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Hicks, thank you for the report, and obviously it's a lot.